I guess rules of thumbs before we go on. If you have questions, the first half of this discussion will be mostly the panelists talking about their research and their work so far. And the second half, there'll be lots of questions. You can ask questions during the second half directly, or you can put them in the chat space. I will be monitoring that. For the speakers, if you don't mind, if you don't mind doing this, you can put on your video when you're speaking. That way we can focus on you and what you're saying. So without further ado, I guess let's just get started. So I guess this is, everybody's aware there's been a firestorm taking over the country and even much of the world at this point. This is in response, the initiating fire was the death of George Floyd in May of last month, and that sparked a conversation that has sort of been simmering. Well, not really simmering. It's been going on for a while, but it's become a focal conversation in the past couple of weeks. This is the question of the use of force by the police in the United States, but more specifically, it's the question of the racially disparate outcomes for use of force in the United States. Now, there's a lot of conversation about the details of that racial disparity, and there's a lot of confusion on statistics around that. And so my general response in when I'm faced with problems for which I have no answer is to try to think of it as a research problem, as a policy researcher. I think most of you here have that same response. But unfortunately, I'm not a criminologist. I don't have that background. So I reached out and I found these four people. Today we have Megan Cahill talking to us, Melissa Labriola, Kristen Warren, and Dick Donahue. Each of them are doing work in the space of criminal justice, policy research in the space of criminal justice. And I'm hoping that in the conversation today, they'll shed useful light on what's going on in the country. Without further ado, I think I will hand it over to the panel. I think we'll start with Megan, then Melissa, then Kristen, then Dick.
Okay. I'm turning my camera on, so it should show up. Can you guys see? Am I showing up for you?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, great. So my name is Megan Cahill. I am a senior policy researcher here at RAND. I am a criminologist, so I do pretty much all criminology research. And in the past several years, I have been doing a lot of work on policing in a variety of different aspects, or from a variety of different perspectives. So one thing that I was like, it still is my favorite project here, was a police community relations tabletop exercise. We haven't done a ton of work on it lately. It kind of got stalled for lack of funding and for a number of reasons, but it's something that we're trying to get started again. But what we did, and Sam Peterson, who I know is on the call, also worked on this with me, as did some other colleagues who are no longer at RAND, but we developed a tabletop exercise that was designed to bring community and police together at the same table. And we tested this in Santa Monica and in Cedar Rapids. And what it did is presented the group with different scenarios that the group would then respond to and kind of talk about how would you react if this event occurred in your community. Who would you go to for information? Who would you trust for reliable information? And it was a way to get people to start talking to each other in a way that wasn't, you didn't get held to. So the police didn't have to be held to sort of what was their response going to be, because it was only a hypothetical incident or event. And then it sort of, we gave 3 rounds of scenarios and then 3 rounds of discussion following that. And it was really interesting. So one of the really interesting things about it was that even though Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Santa Monica are so different. So Santa Monica is much more diverse and much more of a liberal area. And Cedar Rapids, Iowa is about 90% white, and it's in a state that is has more Republican voters. But the conversation that occurred at both of those tabletop exercises was so similar that it was kind of shocking. And the thing that was not shocking about it was that really what came out of it was that there were patterns of systemic racism in both police agencies, according to the community, and that those were the issues that had to kind of be overcome before any progress could be made on police reform. And so while it's not startling, because I've been doing this work for a while and I feel like I have understood that that is a large issue for police for a while, I think it was kind of startling to me that the virtually same conversation occurred in two very different cities, and that this kind of pattern just kind of exists across the US writ large, and that it really is this systemic problem that we're seeing. So that's my kind of main project that I have worked on that has to do with police community relations and really trying to make an effort there. And I will say this was a small effort, but it was really designed to kind of get the conversation started, to sort of bring together key people on the community side with officers and so we were trying to talk to get both field officers, but then also executive level staff involved in the conversation. And so really trying to bring together the two sides to start a conversation that we had the plan would be continued. So we hope to kind of get that back off the ground and to move further with that, because I think it could be a useful tool that can kind of help facilitate some really difficult discussions that are going on right now. So for fear of talking too much, because I feel like I'm passionate about this and I could talk forever, I will pass along the baton to the next person, but I'm happy to answer questions as we move forward.
All right, we'll keep the questions for afterward. I have a couple for you, what you discussed. Melissa, are you up?
I am up. Let's see. Okay. So I'm sharing my video as well. Hello, my name is Melissa Labriola, and I'm a senior social behavioral scientist here at RAND as well. And my experience in this topic has, Megan and I are actually working on one project that is specifically focused on officer use of force. It has been funded with a small amount of money at the beginning, and it just coincidentally, we were funded to do this project just a couple months before George Floyd's death. And so we started, and now we just happen to be kind of in the mix of things. We were funded by a family who had suffered a tragic loss. Their son had been killed by police. And so they are obviously very passionate about this project. And they had many ideas and many research questions or questions that they wanted answered. And I think that they were, along with, I think, the rest of America, surprised by the complete lack of data that is collected at a national level, any sort of national registry that is collecting this information. There are databases here and there that are collecting this information. There are the Washington Post and there's the Guardian that have done it in the past. The FBI has a new database that they started in 2019 that should hopefully be able to give us data in the next couple of years. But without that, there's really, to answer some of these really broad questions, it's very difficult for researchers to do because the data that does exist is often missing or unreliable, and we know that. And so sometimes you have to go directly to the agencies, which, as you can imagine, is difficult to do. So what we're doing for this project is really talking to internal RAND people as well as external stakeholders, and really trying to set up a rigorous research agenda that's based on what are some questions that are out there, what are questions that we can ask and get answered with the data that's available, or data that we can go and reasonably collect. And so that's really exciting. It's good. It's really fast moving, and we're doing it right now. So that is really most prominently focused on what we're talking about. I've also had the opportunity, though, to work with police agencies on their responses to try to strengthen their police community relations. So, for instance, Megan and I and Sam, who I hear is on the call, we are working on evaluating New York City Police Department. They have, in 2015, they implemented what they call neighborhood policing, which is, essentially really, a collaborative problem-solving approach to policing. Definitely a difference in what they had been doing in the earlier years. And they wanted an evaluation done where they could look at whether or not there's 3 outcomes: reduced crime, improved safety and respect between NYPD and their communities, and increased collaborative problem solving. So again, this is not necessarily about use of force, but with the understanding that they have police and community issues, and they just completely changed not only their policing philosophy, but also how they police. So they have dedicated, they call them neighborhood NCOs. What's the C? Neighborhood coordination officers?
Coordination officers, yeah.
And city sector officers who are dedicated to specific precincts and sectors within those precincts. So with this idea that, you become more familiar with your community, you become familiar with the people feel more comfortable telling you about issues more. So that's the idea of neighborhood policing. And we're doing a process and outcome evaluation for that. And then also, and I could also talk for quite a bit, but just tangentially, I work on police deflection, which is essentially police diversion. So it's when police, and I'm working with Sam. Gosh, Sam, you're all over the place. So in particular programs that link people, a little shout out, people who use drugs, police connecting them with services that they need. And it's supposed to curb any involvement with the criminal justice system. That's the idea of diversion. So again, this kind of, building the trust with the community. If you need help, they're called self-referral programs. So essentially people walking into the precinct and being able to be referred to services without any jeopardy of getting involved with the criminal justice system. And just lastly, I worked on a project where domestic violence workers, advocates, and police officers went out together to respond to domestic violence call where there was a child there. So again, this, and I don't know if the conversation will go there, but if we start talking about kind of fragmenting the police and giving social service workers or mental health professionals the responsibilities for some of these things that the police are responsible and maybe not the best equipped to do now. So some of these programs and studies that I've done have touched upon that as well. So I'm sorry, I think I went over my time.
That's good. Thank you very much. Kristen, I think you're doing some work for TNL. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Kristen. Okay, I think that my video is on as well. I am relatively new to RAND and quite a little bit more junior in the criminal justice research realm as some of my colleagues on today's panel. But I did want to, share about my experiences in the space from both at the Capitol and as well as my own personal experience. So prior to coming to RAND, I, participated in the first wave of the Black Lives Matter protests while in Pittsburgh as a graduate student. And, as kind of Shonda kind of alluded to, like, this isn't the first time these types of racial injustice or police brutality cases have come to light. There have been similar situations, some that may not have gotten the national attention as the George Floyd case. But there are many instances or similarities between those that have been publicized and those that have not, including having video footage of the blatant misconduct for, minor offenses that these people were killed over. And so I participated in that, and I'm, more than happy to speak about the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement and how they've been a political force for social justice, especially as pertains to interactions with police. And, based on, I guess, the national and even international response to this particular case, it gives me some hope to see that we are making some progress. It's being called out more. You see a lot of different companies and corporations vowing to put their money towards these social justice efforts and foundations. And with my work at the Sacramento Capitol, you can see that there are specific members who have been working towards this criminal justice reform, both legislators and staff, and even those who have been appointed to certain positions within California. I can only speak to that because that's been my experience. But you can definitely see that there's a different atmosphere than previously with any of the other cases. And one of the other things I wanted to highlight is, just looking at the, I guess, like the gender aspect, as well as those in the LGBT community. So I believe it's Wednesday during the Pride event when they talked about the types of injustices that the LGBT community sees, specifically in even reporting some of the deaths that happened there. I just wanted to highlight that because some of those names you don't really get to see as often, and they're just as important. And so even though we kind of focus in having George Floyd being this poster for the movement, I want to make sure that we highlight all of the faces and names who have been victims of either police brutality, as well as making sure that they get their recognition as well. So my policing work thus far at RAND. So I'm working with the Tech and Narrative Lab on what I've been calling this virtual partner. And it'll be able to use different emerging technologies like micro expressions, biometrics, and that type of thing to analyze the situation, build situational awareness, and kind of inform the officer as they interact with citizens. So it's not meant to be a crutch or a replacement for an officer, but more so an aid in helping them conduct their duties. And so I think it would be, one, helpful to the officer as a health and safety technique or tool, as well as an accountability tool, to where the community feels a little bit more comfortable interacting with officers, kind of like with the body cams. There's been some back and forth on whether or not they have been helpful in easing the community relations between communities of color specifically and police organizations. But I feel like it is still a good stepping stone to start with, as you know, since body cams are relatively new. It's still not really implemented equally across the board from different states to even within the state, and how people are even able to request the footage for the body cam. So I believe that with this virtual partner concept, that perhaps we'll be able to incorporate more technologies that would create a greater sense of community trust. So that's my Tech and Narrative Lab project that I've been working on, and I appreciate Ashande and Todd for allowing me to explore this work. Thanks.
All right. The next person we have is Dick Donahue. I think it's important that he presents a perspective that maybe many researchers don't have access to, i.e., what a former police officer thinks about these issues. So, Dick. Are you on?
Yep, I'm on now. Sorry, yeah, I had to change my background. It's a disaster in my office here. So, hi, thanks for having me on. I've been at RAND for about a year. I retired from the MBTA Transit Police Department in Boston, Massachusetts. So, I worked in policing for a few years. I retired due to injury, but I worked in kind of within all of Eastern Massachusetts, but primarily within the city of Boston. So I have a bit of experience with policing in general, as well as use of force, because it just happens. So hopefully share some of that with you as well. I've done some research into multiple topics in policing, but I think what would probably tie in a bit better is some of the work that I've done in the police training and academy training areas, especially since with some of the new academy training concepts, whether it be the West Coast, the Oregon or Massachusetts models, I got pretty good access to Massachusetts. Some of the concepts they use within the state that we looked at actually tie in very nicely to the the PERF 30, so the 30 guiding principles that are that were suggested and or put forth, I think, almost 5 years ago now, to try to avoid a situation or a nationwide situation that we're in today. I've also worked in the last, I think, 4 to 5 years as well as part of the Valor program. So part of that isn't directly in teaching officers force, but I've trained throughout the country with officers of various ranks and agencies on things like professionalism, response to terror, kind of a lot of it comes down to withholding your oath and how to act in crisis. So we do a lot of case studies as part of that, right? Whether it be the case study of the officer breaking up the pool party in Texas that made the news, or a situation like a George Floyd situation where breaking it down, where do things go wrong? Do you want to be this person? What does your oath say? What does your training say? So some of those things, we've broken down over the last few years to. It's an officer safety program, but we try to tie it together with community safety as well. So with that, I'll be quiet and turn it back over to the crew.
All right. So thank you very much for sharing your research experiences and your life experiences on this topic. I think the primary thing I should start off with is, even though we set up the conversation, the discussion doesn't explicitly, at least the abstract talk doesn't explicitly talk about race. It talks about use of force. I think it's important to be very clear on what the race angle is here. So Megan talked about systemic racism, and definitely the stories, the videos we see on the internet on the topic, they are horrifying, and those stories are part of what made this happen, made this eruption happen. But we need to have some sense. It'd be nice to have the best case argument for the effect, the role race plays in this use of force problem we have in the country. We've seen lots of discussions across the board on statistical analysis of use of force, talking about, it's equal across race when you talk about interaction, but when you talk about use of force, the numbers change. I guess I'm hoping, Megan, maybe I'll come to you first. What's the best case analysis of the role of race in use of force problems you're seeing now?
So I'm not sure I know exactly what you're asking. So are you asking what is the role, or are you asking what evidence is there? Can you just clarify what you're asking? I'm sorry.
I guess I'm more focused on the evidence, because we clearly have a use of force problem, and the question is what's the research evidence for how race plays a role in that? And this is also in response to some of the stuff Melissa mentioned, where there is a shortage of data that would be useful for auditing why these things happen. So how do we make that research case in a ironclad fashion?
Right. And ironclad, I don't know, might be kind of hard to put that stamp on it, but like Melissa said, she and I are working on developing this research agenda, and the main issue is that there's not a lot of data. Now, there have been a number of analyses that have been done on race involved in police stops, and then also in some research done on police or race and use of force, and the demographics of individuals who against whom officers use force. So there have been, from my understanding, it's not my main focus, looking at this research base, but from my understanding, it is, there are definitely in a lot of cities patterns that indicate that there is a racial element, but it's not 100% clear that that's always the case, that there's always that race, or that the patterns can always be explained by race. And so I think that it's a very nuanced area, and I think it's really hard to kind of tease apart all of the issues there. And I think one of the things is that when we look at it at kind of the level of individual stops, we're looking at, the way that we think about it is thinking about kind of what is the level of bias or racism that is from the individual officer. And I think that when you put it that way, it's really hard to say, this number of cops we think they're racist or they're not racist, because a lot of individuals, don't show racist patterns. But when you put cops in a whole system that is kind of built around this pattern of systemic racism, that's the main issue. So I don't think, looking at it at an individual officer level is not an effective way, I think, to address some of these patterns that we see going on. So I really think we need to be stepping back, and we need to be looking at what are the policies that have set us up to, end up with these patterns. And it extends throughout the entire criminal justice system. So it starts with policing, who gets arrested, who gets sent to jail, who gets off with a warning, those kinds of things. But then it goes on to, how does a court system treat defendants, and especially defendants who cannot pay for their own lawyer. And then it just gets perpetuated throughout into the correctional system. And so I just think that we need to step away from looking at it as like an individual officer problem and looking at it as a systemic problem. If that.
And just to add, I mean, the research is based on data that is flawed. And that right there is the first problem in terms of a research answer to this. And the research that has been done, as Megan said, has looked at individual and situational factors. And again, so that's just the data that's being collected, and that's the data that researchers have access to. So that's going to be very, very, not very deep, very ground level data just regarding, the race or the gender or the officer and of the victim and of the situation that was going on. We know much less. Research is very, very sparse on the agency and community factors. And it's that macro, it's that higher level that is kind of perpetuating the police culture, as people wanted to call it, or even what's going on in the community, to try to understand what's going on in the community. And we know less about that. So I think to answer your question, that we know obviously race is playing a part in this, but we're at a deficit because of the data, and we're at a deficit because it's such a macro question. To really get at the question, we should be answering it at all these levels, and that's even harder. So, not that we shouldn't, but it just poses a big problem. And funding, it's really hard to get the funding to do any of these really great ideas, or has been. I mean, maybe another tide with what's going on in the country right now will be the opening up of some funding for this, for researchers to do good work.
Kristen, Dick, thoughts on this?
I guess I'll kind of respond in a question format, which is, basically to Megan and Melissa's point, of it being a systemic issue within the police force. From your experiences, what would be something that you can do to help shape or change the systemic system? I feel like from, my experience in the legislature in trying to get the use of force bill passed, one of their issues was, the police unions and the power that they have in order to make these monumental changes. For example, it was basically a change in a simple word in the, the actual language of the statute that said what is reasonable versus something that it was a very hand wavy term, to where they were trying to say was it justified? So reasonable to justified, and that's just in California, and it received a lot of national attention. It had celebrities behind it, different associated advocacy groups behind it, but it didn't really push the envelope far enough. But it was to where we could get it based on the amount of pushback from different police unions and that type of thing. So what types of changes could we make that would be systemic? And I really want to hear from Dick on this as well, how we could go about making those changes without the pushback. And I guess it kind of goes into, something that I'm not sure we're going to get to today, about what would defunding the police look like? Is that a real issue that we should even be considering? And, you know, there's one thing between, you know, defunding the police versus abolishing police, which is also parts of the conversations you'll see in multiple communities right now talking about. So what would that look like? And are these conversations necessary? And yes, I do feel like there should be some type of reform, but how can you truly get that without the full support of the police departments? So.
Asking a tough.
I'll let Nick come first on this one because you're the only one who hasn't talked.
I was trying to defer because I don't have an answer. Although I do recall that the California case, but I think that comes down to the Graham standard and kind of the discussion today, where moving the terminology on use of force to I think some of the wording that I've seen is exhaust all measures before using fatal force, and one of the pushback on exhausting all measures before you use fatal force or before you use deadly force is active shooter situation. Do you have to go in there first and try to use cooperative controls and then compliant controls and move each step up the continuum while somebody's shooting at somebody or at you? And I think that's where some of the pushback is. It's a pushback against what's been in place since Graham v. Connor. I can't remember the year of that, and the policy follow it on that, and the fact that there's been millions of officers trained, looking at the objectively reasonable standards, so that how reasonable were your actions in X moment, and how are you going to be judged on that, and not via hindsight. So I think that's where there will, at least for the deadly force, which is still around 1,000. It's held fairly steady around 1,000 uses where somebody has actually died. So not just use of deadly force can be, I wouldn't say me, but it's just easier. Me shooting at somebody and missing, that's a use of deadly force, but the person wouldn't die if I didn't hit them. But we've held steady at that. So I think that's where a lot of the problem may lie, is just in what's been there for a long time, and is only a small fraction of the grand scheme of things. And if we talk about use of force numbers and James Fife, I think, said in 1990 something that, hey, we're still relying on the Washington Post for data, and this is before the Washington Post had the fatal encounters data, and there's still no data on police use of deadly force and fatalities, and that's just a real small sliver of the overall use of force picture. So we don't even know what the overall use of force picture is, and how it differs from a city or town of 4 officers to 40,000. So.
To just kind of follow up on Kristen's question, just kind of at large. So I think that, going back to the idea of having to take a real macro look, and what Melissa was saying, a macro look, I mean, I think we have to look at places like what Camden did, where they fired all the officers. They still have a police force, but they rehired officers in a very intentional way, trying to hire officers that they thought were going to sort of fit in this new way of doing policing that they were trying to achieve. And so I think there are very few examples of this having been done, but I think in order to get some of these changes made, I think we need some real radical ideas for, how to, I don't even like to use the word reform, because I think reform means we're still working within the same system. I mean, I think that we really need to think about kind of transforming what the police look like.
So I'm going to push us forward. I'm going to ask one more question and then give it a free for all. So as I'm asking this question, if anybody else has thoughts for what they would like to hear from the panel, I'll start teeing that up. I think that the one question I want to ask relates to a point that has come up a couple of times already. As policy researchers, we rely on funding to do work in the public interest. And I'm wondering who is there that funds work that's solely in the public interest, that takes the concerns of the individual person and sort of elevates it to a research program that policy research can answer. I asked this question largely because a while ago I was talking to a couple of Black Lives Matter activists in the context of a class that we were trying to teach, and the primary thing they told me was, we've been talking about these issues for many years, but we don't expect people like you at RAND to take this seriously because we don't have a police office, an LAPD budget to fund research on these types of questions. How do we elevate the concerns of people who don't have the budget of agencies or institutions to essentially form research projects around? It's an annoying question. I realize that, and maybe RAND is not necessarily tuned to doing that type of work, but it's an important piece of work because, as we see, this issue has been simmering for many years, and it's only now becoming a policy concern that seems to be worthy of research dollars. I know it's an annoying question. Anybody want to take a stab?
I mean, I think that all I can say is that this topic and other sensitive and highly political, often topics, are so. A lot of the money that we go for is from the government, and that is a real problem when the political system might not match. I'm trying to say this so delicately, but I think y'all know what I mean. So in terms of the federal government, that is an issue. But I mean, but even with a more a Democratic president, it wasn't as though that there was a ton of funding for this either. So I mean, I kind of want to blame it on the political climate right now, but I think it's always been an issue. But I do think, and with Megan and I getting the private donor money right now, and the foundations have really stepped up in criminal justice as a whole, have stepped up to try to take the place and try to take that hole that the government is not able to fill in terms of some important topic areas. So I don't know if it's enough, or if the conversation is driven enough for these private foundations, or the Arnold Foundation or MacArthur, or these big ones to but they're interested in criminal justice reform, and and maybe that is kind of where the money has to lie, and that's where we have to go for it. The unfortunate problem is that we're all going. RAND, everybody is all going for this same pot of money.
I mean, another problem also just for RAND, and this is totally like. Doesn't really matter but for places like RAND, it's really hard for us to get funding from foundations because they usually have a lot of restrictions. So anyone here who's tried to get funding from a foundation has probably come up against overhead rates, etc., because there's restrictions in that way. But that's just a problem for places like RAND. I mean, I think there's plenty of researchers out there at in academic institutions or at individual organizations that could definitely go after this money and could make a real dent in the kind of lack of research that we have in this area. But I think Melissa hit the nail on the head, which is that to date, most of our criminology funding has come from DOJ, from the research arm of DOJ, which is the National Institute of Justice, and in the current administration. There's not much coming out of that, but she's right. Even in the previous administrations, especially on police use of force, there wasn't a ton. Obama did actually fund the 21st Century Policing Project and effort, and came up, with a whole list of recommendations for reforming policing, which of course went out the window with the current administration. But I do hope, and I do actually expect, I'm pretty optimistic that this period right now is going to open up a lot of funding for us. And I do think Sunday made a really good point, is that we shouldn't not take people seriously just because they don't have the money to do the research, right? I think it's a great opportunity for us to incorporate the voices of activists and the community into our research, and to, be advising our research and informing our research more than we probably have done in the past.
Yeah, I want to add something as well, specifically to the folks who asked, the activists who came into the graduate school. So UCLA, I really want to applaud them on the Bunch Center that they have. So the Bunch Center is focused on African American policies specifically, and what they've been doing is they, go out and they engage the community. They bring them in, teach them how to code and how to conduct research, and they do research on their community on projects and ideas that matter to them. And one of those projects is $1 Million Hoods, where they basically got all the information regarding how much money is levied from Black communities, and showcased how much money was taken out of the Black community based just to pay for bail alone, which ended up being millions of dollars taken out of the community. And then that goes into question, like, why were these people arrested in the first place? And you got to think about like the whole concept around policing. And so how one of their biggest funders for the past year was the California State Legislature, because they did approach the Black Caucus. And I'd say, like, just like with any other organization, whether it's an institution or a group of researchers and that type of thing, you have to engage your political members. And in this case, it was the Black Caucus. And so I was the facilitator in making, that exchange, so then that way they would get funded. They ended up getting like $3.2 million to do their work on researching in the Black community. And having Black researchers, you're funding Black students to conduct this type of research that matters to them. And so I feel like, there's one way of, applying to grants, and then there's another way of appealing to these political members who are voted in to support them in their efforts. And so I would say, like, that was a really good method that a lot of people do not think about. How do you approach members in a way that they can relate to you? It's something that they're also passionate about, and you're able to showcase, hey, here's the research that we've currently done and how we plan to expand upon that if you were able to financially support us. And so that's exactly what the Bunch Center did. They had to go around the official UCLA policy of, their political or public policy arm, and go directly to the source, because otherwise they would still have to pay the overhead of the universities. So I think it really depends on the structure of the organization that they're from, what kind of background that they already have, and who they plan to reach out to, who do have big pockets of money that they can distribute. So that would be my 2 cents.
Let's have questions from the group. I assume at least one person has a bunch of burning questions on this. If not, I'll ask one more question. Anybody? Let's see.
I just put something in the chat.
Do you want to?
Sure. So yeah, you guys touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think there's more to be said. Something I've been struck with, well, like in the Floyd case, what Chauvin did was clearly illegal. That was not department policy. Nobody thinks that is okay. But yet there were 3 officers standing by allowing it to happen. And 2 of them were brand new. One of them was not brand new. But even so, all right, it's not like the police weren't there. The police were there. A murder was happening. They weren't stopping it. When we saw the protester get pushed down and bleeding from the back of his head, and there was a lot of pressure on people who wanted, cops who wanted to stop and help, being told, keep moving. There seems to be a fairly pervasive, I have some knowledge of this firsthand too, a fairly pervasive culture of police looking out for each other. And I understand it's a dangerous job they're doing. They do need to look out for each other. But, they also need to look out for the public. So it seems like there's an environment where it's very hard for the police to police themselves, for the police to actually check each other's behavior and look out for public safety. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on how do we change the rules? How do we change the training so people don't do bad things in the first place? But it seems like the issue is, how do we make the police work to actually enforce policies and, keep people safe? I don't know how to study that. How do you think about that? How do you go at that as a problem for how we know what to change? I mean, unions, I guess, but I don't know how to write a proposal for studying that.
Well,
Yeah.
Oh.
Do you want me to jump in?
Oh, sure. And I'll follow up.
Sorry, you might have the same thing. One of the big things that actually makes an effect of that, and you've seen probably some of the most instantaneous changes I've ever seen in law enforcement are the effects of actual department policy and subsequent punishment. So policy itself, in some of these cases, being more unilateral from the police executive levels is something that might trigger that change, and has shown to have effects on use of force in the past. So some of these duty to intervene type I think, again, that's another one of the Perf 30, I think. If they weren't already in there, you're seeing in major cities that is those policies are being implemented. So an analysis or evaluation on the effects of that policy or others would be something and worthwhile to see if that does change change behaviors in the short and long term.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, in a field where we really lack evidence-based guidance on best practices, the research there's over 40 years of research that has shown that the more restrictive use of force policies that agencies have do indeed reduce police use of force. And some of those, and they have been able to kind of, so Samson Sin Yangwei, he was able to look at all 8, if you go on, I think it's the Police Use of Force website, also Campaign Zero. He has the 8 big policy recommendations, and he did a big study on looking at if you implement all 8 compared to 7, compared to 6. And then again, the more, and one of them, the reason I'm telling you this is one of them is this idea of intervening by fellow officers, and almost you have to intervene in a point where you think you have to, and if you don't, you will be you have the same punishment or repercussions than the officer who indeed did do something. You wouldn't be more of like an accomplice, which is happening in Minneapolis. So there are studies that have looked at kind of all of the different use of force policies on their own, as well as when agencies combine them. And it does show that by combining them and by putting a lot of these really restrictive use of force policies in practice and actually implementing them and actually standing by them, that the use of force does decrease. So, I get excited about that because I do think it's some of these are so hard because it's hard to find an actual research question. But I think a lot of these policies, that if you could get a department to implement them and implement them correctly with reliability, then you could do a study on it. But again, you'd have to have collaboration of the police department. But yeah, so it's a great point, and I think that it's one that can actually be done.
Mm. Okay, I think we have one more person. Graham, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I wanted to ask about police training, because we're talking about culture here, and a lot of culture begins, as far as I understand it, at police academy, where police training is originally done. And I don't hear a lot of talk about research or modifications to the police academy system and how training is originally done and the culture that builds among police officers. And as far as I understand it, those academies are staffed by veteran officers who sort of take the older police culture and place it on new officers coming up through the ranks. And so it does a lot of that continuity of culture training that you might want to remove if you're trying to do reform. And yet I don't hear anyone talking about changing police academy culture or the police academy process as a whole. So I'd like to hear people's thoughts on whether that is being considered or done at all. And then I wanted to put up what I think is a relatively mild suggestion that we look at the reporting structure of the police as well, in that there's a single hierarchy in most police departments, as far as I understand it, where everyone reports up through, you have basically a chain of command system. And as long as you have a single hierarchy like that, then bad actors at any point in that chain can start disrupting anything anywhere below them with relative impunity. And so I think in order to have a police department, and we talked about applying good practices across the whole police department, if part of the police department doesn't want to play nice, isn't playing nice, isn't interested in following the laws, as we've seen here that Chauvin, for example, already was doing something that was already against policy, already illegal. The only way that I think that you see that stopped is by changing the single hierarchy into at least a dual hierarchy, where they have to report to someone else who then looks over the shoulder of the original hierarchy. There are better ways to phrase that, but they're skipping my mind at the moment. So that's kind of a two-pronged question. I apologize for giving you two at once, but I don't think I'll get a chance to speak again. I wanted to cover them both. Thanks.
And Dick should definitely take this.
I was just going to say.
I was going to duck out for a second. I was getting messages on there. So as far as academy training, there have been changes. Actually, there's been some of us at RAND talking about what we can do in whether it be at the state level or in conjunction with the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training. IADLIST. I would have just said that, but I want to make sure everybody knew what it was. So several of us have actually been talking with folks at IADLIST about either working on a nationwide training needs assessment, or using some of the virtual AI type opportunities that some folks at RAND here have been working on to improve academy training. So there have been movements on that, and there's I think 620 different law enforcement training academies throughout the country that operate. Some operate at colleges, others operate on their own, and there's a kind of a multitude of man, I love the police academy, but there's a number of ways they're done. So there's like high stress, modified stress, the kind of low stress, kind of professional gentleman's type academy, as they be kind of traditionally called. So certainly a lot of opportunity there, and the one word of caution is you can change all the things in the academy, and I think there's a lot of things you can teach, whether it be enhanced communication skills, which is probably one of the top things to work on, but just that the second you get out of the academy, you don't get a salty field training officer, right? And you can go back in any of the old. I have this book on my desk, Policing: A View from the Street, 1974. This thing's all tattered, but I think one of the quotes even from that is the rookie's first week on the street, and the FTO goes, "Hey kid, forget everything you learned at the academy. I'm going to tell you what the streets are really like." And I'd heard that too, and I'm like, all right, like from somebody that's a useless slug. That's a term, like a policing term, but I think that's where your next nip in the bud is. And even if you look at what happened in Minneapolis, right? 2 of those people were on field training. And, the second I heard that, I mean, like, I had to, like, shut my phones down and everything because I was just fired up. I'm like, that's where, like, your next turning point in that, life course of an officer is. And just, I was fired up about that because it's just like that's exactly where a problem point is, and it went the worst way it could go. So so I'll leave it at that for the academy type stuff. But I think that especially with some of the work Rand's done in the past and what we're doing today, that there is an opportunity to do evaluation and improvements there. So.
And I just want to add just really quickly, I mean, there has been research done, but definitely needs more on the de-escalation trainings that the police officers receive and the hours of de-escalation that they should receive. And also, you know, crisis intervention training. I mean, there's other trainings that some officers in some departments have larger CIT programs than others. Some, you know, so there is work there. So in terms of that, that moment where you could be intervening, and whether it be with this de-escalation or whether it be with someone who is in crisis, being more properly trained to do that. And then I just want to add, and I'm not sure if it actually answers your second question, but maybe more toward the culture, something that I'm finding myself more and more interested in that I would love to do research on is this militarization of the police. The police have become more militarized. The former military people are often military, I don't know what they're called, military people are coming into the police forces. And I think that that's just obviously changing an already very insular and culture of the police, and you're bringing in this, you know, this more military code of whatever they learn there. And that's just so interesting to me that, you know, while we're trying to shift away from, you know, police being away from warriors to more like guardians, I think that's going to be really hard to do. And so I'm not sure if that actually answers your second question. It's just something that gets me all fired up that I would love to do research on.
One thing that I wanted to jump in on too, that I think is an issue with it, that has to do with training, but also the culture, is that for a lot of these things, the training happens at academy, and then, you know, on de-escalation training, you might not actually get de-escalation training again. So the way that the training works is you have to have a certain number of hours every year, but a lot of times you can choose what you get the actual training in, and so they're not actually getting kind of re-upped training on some of the key things, like Dick mentioned, communication, or, you know, so they might not actually have the most up-to-date training. So I think more requirements for specific types of training as you move through your career and up the different steps could also help.
And I'm not even sure if we know what's necessarily great training anyway. I mean, again, not evidence-based. So Dick, that's great that you're working on some sort of you know, I mean, maybe that's what they need. I mean, who knows what kind of, even if you did get de-escalation training, I mean, who knows if it's any quote unquote good or actually helps. I don't know.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing onto that. When you're talking about what types of training someone should undergo. So when I first came to RAND, one of my ideas had to do with kind of like this risk assessment tool where you're able to say like, hey, we've gotten these types of complaints, whether it's from the community or observations from their peers within the police force. But this tool would be able to say like, hey, we've noticed that you've responded maybe like negatively in these types of situations. So we're recommending that you take a de-escalation course, or we recommend that you take some type of course that helps you deal with those with mental health issues. And so I'm thinking that, you know, perhaps that could be a way where we can try to pinpoint areas that an officer could better be better trained to interact in the field, when we have some data points on what areas that they can work on. I'm not sure exactly how I would go about doing that, but that was just something that we could think about. What types of, you know, since this is the Tech and Narrative Lab, what type of tools can we utilize, technical tools can we utilize to try to build a database on, you know, skills that need to be developed within an officer, within the department, whether it's just one unit or the entire department or whoever's in charge. So there'll be different layers of attack that you can, you know, better train your police force on. So that would be my recommendation.
Let me piggyback on that question, and this will be the final thing before I let the panel go. It's not really a question; it's just your raw, unfiltered thoughts on the role of technology in the use of force problem, either as a solution or as an enabler, or like where do you think technology fits as a way to tackle or understand the problem we're currently grappling with? people have talked about how body cams might help us save policing. Others have suggested it's a terrible idea. I don't know. Any raw thoughts on this?
I mean, I think my just kind of unfiltered thought is that technology can be an assistant. It can be it can help, but it can't drive everything. The initial, all of the changes have to be driven by people and by interactions with people and how you train people, and the technology is there just to assist. So there's been actually a lot of work in the last 5 years on body cams, and there's no clear evidence that they're actually encouraging less use of force, and they can selectively be turned off. So I think there's more we can do with body cams, that kind of technology, to see if we can get them to be more effective. But I think that's just one small example of how, sure, it can help, but you still have to deal with the human factor. And I think the human factor of policing comes first.
And I mean, and just another example of exactly what Megan just said, the University of Chicago Crime Lab is working on that, the early intervention system with the Chicago PD, and they've now with other agencies as well. And the critics of that, both researchers and people who are working on it, is the exact same thing. You can have the early intervention system, but there's so much that can't be captured, and whether or not the supervisors actually adhere to it, and all of those different issues. So again, it's a very useful tool, but there's so much human error to that as well. To completely rely on it, it would be faulty.
Mm.
Yeah, I would add that you should really think about implementation and how you go about using the body cams, for example, because yes, even though someone may have it as part of their uniform, if they aren't using it appropriately, they don't turn it on, they don't take the data back to the department, if they have difficulties requesting, if the public has difficulty requesting access to the video cam prior to a court date, for example, like there are a lot of layers to help prevent the public from actually gaining access to the footage, to try to change people's thoughts and perception. And I think I've also read in a couple of people's literature where just even announcing that they are recording with their body cam, that can change people's disposition during the course of the interaction. So I think that I think it's mostly about implementation, not solely based on the technology itself. And so we should really think about what are easier ways to implement a technology. How do we make this universal across departments, across the nation, on implementing the different types of technology solutions that we will recommend.
Yep, and I'll go kind of quickly. Just a couple of things I think about when I look at the enhanced technology, other than kind of government surveillance aspect of it, is just the cyber vulnerability that we've already seen occur to different law enforcement agencies, but the increased risk of cyber vulnerability, but also if you look at the human aspect of it, and we're sitting in a chief's office, and we got this great presentation on how it was facial recognition plus transcription plus a body camera system, and this could be all yours for whatever the price was per month per officer. And then, we did the math pretty quickly, and it's like, well, I have 100 officers times, $5,000 a month, how many officers do you want me to fire? And by the way, I need to hire more people to review all this and to fix it when it goes wrong, to have an IT person, and to review everything for records. So just the how some of these things can affect the staffing at the sworn and non-sworn positions is just another factor that we should think about when we're looking at technology solutions for any of this.
We are over time, and I think there are people who want to ask a couple more questions. But let's be respectful of our panelists. We can keep the conversation going, but I assume people can leave whenever they want to, including our panelists. Let's first of all thank our speakers. This was glorious. This was useful. I'm grateful for your attention and your time on these issues. I guess any passing thoughts, any final thoughts, and if somebody wants to keep the questions going, feel free to ask.
I'll say I appreciate you, Ashande, for putting this panel together. I think it, at least, if not anything else, started a really good discussion on things that we can actually do from our end at RAND to try to keep the conversation going, maybe ideas for potential research projects and collaboration. So thanks, Ashande and Todd, for putting this together.
Echo that. Same thing here. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This was great to hear from our colleagues, also to hear from my colleagues, for me as well. So I enjoyed participating.
All right. Without further ado, have a good evening, have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you guys later.
You too. Thank you very much. Bye.